Well, we're going to go ahead and get started, folks. And I apologize in advance for whatever's going on with the projector. We tried both of the laptops, and yeah. So the graphics may be a little bit interesting, but we don't want to waste more time. So if you were expecting a rather diminutive but extremely bright French guy in here talking about twags and twaps and SAMOG and a bunch of other weird 3GPP acronyms, you're kind of out of luck because Yves couldn't be here. He's somewhere around the world deploying a network. But Marcus and I are very excited to be here this morning to talk to you about some stuff going on with public Wi-Fi. I'm Dave Wright, been working in and out of data networking for about 21 years now, and currently at Ruckus doing tech marketing and specifically working on the public and carrier space.
Yeah, and I'm Marcus Burton. Just a quick introduction. I'm also at Ruckus on the tech marketing team and I'm just kind of a general tech marketing guy. So don't focus as much on carrier stuff, in the traditional sort of Hotspot 2.0 stuff, but focus mostly on the enterprise. So we're going to kind of tag team a little bit here, but mostly focus on this guy.
So before we get too far into it, I thought it would be good to pause and just kind of think about what we as an industry, what we as WLAN professionals can learn from other industries. So who can tell me who these individuals are? Anyone? Just shout it out.
Syracuse basketball coach.
Yeah, Jim Boeheim on the left. And Mike Krzyzewski on the right. And you can tell I'm a Duke fan. I've got to represent because they're playing Carolina tonight. But my point here is these are the two winningest coaches in Division I college basketball history, right? They're both north of 900 now. They've both run exceptional programs, and they're fierce competitors. So Syracuse joined the Atlantic Coast Conference, so they're now in the same conference as Duke, and they played their first game as conference competitors about 2 weeks ago, I believe it was. And it was probably the best college basketball game that was played this year so far. It was back and forth, went to overtime. I thought Duke was going to get slaughtered in overtime because two of our best players had fouled out. The overtime was exciting, went down to the wire. The referees blew a no call on one of our guys going for a dunk. But anyway, Syracuse won the game by 2 points in overtime. But it was just an exceptionally well-played game by two excellent coaches and two excellent programs. And so here they are being fierce competitors. And here they are in a totally different setting. Again, I apologize for the graphics, but this is them on the staff of the USA men's team, the Olympic program. So Krzyzewski's the head coach. Boeheim is one of his assistants. They work together. And this sort of reminded me just of what we've got going on here. I really love this setting. I love coming together with folks from across the industry. We can be fierce competitors in certain situations, and we can be really good friends and collaborators in other situations. To one of GT's points yesterday, these guys also have very different styles and different approaches. So Krzyzewski is a fierce advocate of what's called the man-to-man defense, and Boeheim has perfected a zone defense. And until a few years ago, I don't think Krzyzewski knew how to spell zone. And now he's actually starting to incorporate some of that into his program. So again, controllerless, controlled, all the different options. There are different approaches, and we can learn from each other. So that's my little thought on what we can learn from college basketball. So into the meat of the presentation, we're going to talk a lot about just sort of what's going on with public Wi-Fi, and then touch on some stuff that's really going on more the cellular and licensed spectrum side of the house as well. Everybody has their obligatory data tsunami slide. In every marketing slide that comes out about wireless, you have to talk about just this hockey curve going up and to the right of what's going on with wireless data. And I believe that is true. I believe all the forecasts that mobile wireless data is going through the roof. But what I would contend is that most of it is actually being serviced by Wi-Fi. And a few things that I would point your attention to would be what's going on with the service providers. So a few examples up here. China Mobile, now somewhere north of 4 million APs and on their way to 6 million APs for CMTC's network. They've reported, they actually are really good because they break it down pretty granularly in their semi-annual reports. And it looks like north of 70% of all of their data traffic is now going over Wi-Fi for China Mobile. Cable Wi-Fi here in the US, that's the alliance of 5 of the biggest MSOs, that is cable companies in the US. And they went from essentially having a 0 hotspot presence a couple of years ago to now having about 250,000 hotspots deployed across the country. And really in that time became the largest hotspot operator in the country. And kind of to just add one thing to that, Comcast came out recently and said, they've recently begun deploying a new generation of residential cable modems that, in addition to advertising the resident or the consumer's SSID, they're now starting to broadcast the Xfinity Wi-Fi SSID. It's sort of a fawn model. And Comcast just announced that deployment is going to approach 1 million hotspots in the very near future. So the scale of some of these SP deployments is quite amazing. You've got obviously guest Wi-Fi. These are just a few examples. We all are familiar. Harris Teeter is a little grocery store chain in North Carolina that I go to, and I'm just blown away that they have guest Wi-Fi now. So it really is becoming more and more common that when you go into a retail establishment, they will have a guest option. Public transit, there's the Lufthansa announcement, National Rail over in the UK, put in at all their stations, more and more train companies putting it on board. London Taxi, the black cabs over there, they all now pretty much are in the process of getting equipped with Wi-Fi. And then other players, right? So many large projects that were either directly deployed or sponsored by players like Google, Microsoft, and Facebook. And what it's really coming down to is this, I think this statement by a friend of mine summed it up well. If it has a broadband connection and it's a place that people stop for a while, it's going to become a hotspot. And that's really where this is heading. So hotspots are just proliferating like mad. And I think Andrew used this sort of term, I think he maybe said utility. Same idea, that Wi-Fi really is just becoming a venue amenity. And you wouldn't think about starting up a business and not offering restrooms or air conditioning or lights, right, in your venue. You're not going to be able to do that and not offer a Wi-Fi service to your guests either. So, Hotspot 2.0. We've got all this Wi-Fi that's going to be out there. There's going to be ubiquitous access pretty much everywhere you go. Hopefully you'll be covered by somebody's network, private, public, whatever. How do we make it work? And how do we make it work well and easily for the user? And the idea, the marketing term that I've seen thrown around a lot is sort of we're trying to make Wi-Fi as easy to use as cellular. And I personally bristle at that a little bit because I believe we're trying to make Wi-Fi roaming or Wi-Fi authentication peering easier than cellular. And the reason that I say that is if you look at the licensed bands that are in operation around the world, I don't know, if you look at 2G, 3G, and 4G licensed bands, I'm not even sure the number, but it's north of 40, probably north of 50 if I'm not mistaken. So you really don't know if you get an LTE phone from AT&T here in the States. Certainly if you take that to China where they use a totally different LTE technology, it's not going to work. But even if you go to parts of Europe or Africa, that may not work because the bands may not be supported there. So the band fragmentation that's present on the cellular side, I think undercuts the roaming story a little bit. There's also now just the proliferation of Wi-Fi only devices. And obviously, GSM or LTE type roaming does nothing for a Wi-Fi only device. And then thirdly, what a lot of people do when they travel internationally, the first thing they do is they either turn off roaming or they go and they buy a local SIM from one of the operators if they've got an unlocked device. And so the economics of cellular roaming discourage people from using it. So The economic discussion, that'll come, but if Wi-Fi is just offered as an amenity and we have the ability to use a credential on your phone or on your laptop to authenticate, regardless of where you are around the world, then I think we're going to see that the Wi-Fi paradigm is actually much easier than the cellular roaming paradigm has been. So what does it offer? Obviously, we get the automatic connection. We get the security associated with 802.1x and WPA2 Enterprise. We're now abstracting the authentication from the access. So we're essentially, leveraging 802.1x, but taking it up into a public scale. And we'll talk about that more with Hotspot 2.0. And the end result is that we get more users on the network. And so if I'm an operator, I want my subscribers on my network, if possible, especially if I'm trying to do things with analytics to monetize that. If I'm a retailer, I want people on my network for the same thing. I can either analyze what they're doing, their location and their traffic patterns, what kind of things they're looking at. I can do some push marketing. So the ultimate benefit of Hotspot 2.0 is getting people onto the network. A little bit about who's doing what in the landscape. You've got, obviously, the IEEE with the 802.11u spec. That came out back in 2011 now. That is the foundational technology that all of this is based on. And Marcus is going to go into a little bit more detail on that. Wi-Fi Alliance took the 802.11u standard, and then they started working on the Hotspot 2.0 technical specification and program. So that's where a lot of the specific access network query protocol, or ANQP elements, were defined. Some of them were defined by IEEE, but a number of them were defined within the WFA and the WFA Hotspot 2.0 task group. The certification name from the WFA is Passpoint. So people will use Hotspot 2.0 and Passpoint pretty much interchangeably at this point. The Wireless Broadband Alliance. This is a group mostly of operators, but there are also a number of vendors, both device vendors and infrastructure vendors, who participate in the WBA. And the WBA sponsors these next generation hotspot trials, or NGH trials. And the NGH trials are mostly associated with how to do the roaming or peering, the radius peering between providers. And also you've got companies such as Cineverse and Ascent and Compphone who do the peering. And most of them have been involved in cellular roaming and cellular clearing for some time. And now they're looking at this business of getting into clearing Passpoint credentials between operators. So they would be a roaming hub connecting the radius infrastructure of a number of operators. And then finally we have Cable Labs. Cable Labs represents the multiple system operators in North America, so all the largest cable companies. They were largely responsible for this cable Wi-Fi consortium that we talked about earlier. And they are now working with the WBA to harmonize the harmonize the roaming framework so that the MSOs will be able to peer with the mobile operators as well. In terms of the timeline or the release schedule, release 1 of Passpoint launched back in the summer of 2012. Release 2, the technical spec is done on release 2. There's been 5 rounds of what they call plug fests, where all the infrastructure and device vendors have come together and met in a room in Santa Clara, and everybody goes through these different test procedures to make sure that things are interoperating and working properly. There's been 5 rounds of those. Those are pretty much done. It's now moving towards the testbed establishment by the WFA, and then we expect the certification will launch, and the WFA has said that it should launch in the first half of this year. So, and then release 3 of Hotspot 2.0 is actually in development right now in terms of defining the MRD and what it's going to address. So,
question.
Yes.
So under the Cable Lab section there, harmonizing of that framework, so MSOs to SPs, in relation to that, does that also include not just the roaming between those two entities, but also the handoff from cell to Wi-Fi?
Oh, okay. So no, it wouldn't address directly what you're talking about in terms of the radio link, the radio handoff.
Signaling control from
Right. No, I mean 3GPP is working on that. That's where actually things like SAMOG and S2A mobility over GTP. So no, this is really more about the seamless authentication roaming and peering, not the radio roaming. One last slide on this. So I just wanted to give a shout out. I know we have a number of folks here who have eduroam in their institutions. I really view eduroam as a great example of the possibilities of what Hotspot 2.0 can deliver. So eduroam, interinstitutional roaming, kind of started in Europe and Asia, now becoming much more popular all over the world. 802.1x based, you got the different EAP types that are supported there. They have the idea of an entity provider and a service provider, which map loosely to what we would call a Hotspot 2.0 auth provider or network operator. It's SSID based still, which is one of the differences, and Marcus is kind of going to go into how we're using Hotspot 2.0 to move away from that. But just a shout out to eduroam, and I believe they're also looking at implementing Hotspot 2.0 mechanisms within their infrastructure as well. But I love following the tweets about eduroam because it's typically some user who is provisioned at a campus somewhere, and they just are traveling, and they're like, oh, my device just connected. It's like, yeah, and that's the way it should be. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marcus.
Thank you, sir.
On release 1.
So how many of you with Hotspot 2.0 feel like you're familiar to some extent? Okay, good group. Okay, so just comparing really Hotspot 2.0 and 802.11u and what Dave talked about, release 1 and release 2. So release 1 is really all about protocol plumbing, 802.11 plumbing. How do we get information elements? How do we get frame exchanges? All those types of things that are necessary but not really sufficient for the whole solution. So that's what release 1 is all about. And so that's what I'm going to talk about here just briefly, 10 or 15 minutes. And then release 2, which Dave will sort of take over for that again, is really all about making that plumbing useful, building something on top so that you can actually implement the plumbing in some type of effective way. So, thinking about the demand or the need for 11u, we all know, you go to a hotspot today and the process is just manual, right? So you look for a list of SSIDs, and the SSID may or may not tell you something about the network, depending on how well it was named and where you're at and how many SSIDs there are. And just as a case in point, I was in Germany about a year ago in the airport, and had 30 minutes to catch up on email. You do a quick search for SSIDs and you see 15, and 5 or 6 of them are open, and I don't know which one's free, which one's not. I don't know anything about it other than this is the name of the network. And so you do find out the name, and then you find out basic security, and you find out nothing else. So Hotspot 2.0 really, as a first step is let's provide information to the end user, him or herself, as well as the connection manager on the device, so that it can make a decision about a network prior to associating. It has some information to use to, as a basis to make a decision, which network do I join? So that's really sort of the whole idea here. So instead of just SSID and basic security traditionally, now we have, just reading from the slide here, network access types, whether it's enterprise or public network, whether there's going to be a fee or not after you connect, internet speed, internet status, connection capabilities, what protocols, what ports are even available on that network. So, if it's, UDP, HTTP, HTTPS, those types of things. What roaming partners. So, what your authentication credential, which partners are valid. Is that valid for NAI realms? So, if you have an authentication credential at a certain realm, can it be used here? The venue type and name, for marketing and for identification of the venue owner and the operator. So, there's all this information, even IP addressing, you get more security, you find out about EAP types, all this type of stuff can be factored into that decision. So just looking at it from a practical perspective, so there are multiple devices that support release 1 today. Samsung, Galaxy S3 does, iOS does, even Mavericks does as well. So just looking at one implementation of it, for any of you who have kids and have Sesame Street. One of these things is not like the other. So from a connection manager perspective, they all look the same, right? We pick an SSID, and you either pre-configure the SSID in security settings, or you connect to it and you have your connection manager saves that profile, right? So in Mavericks, you have a list of SSIDs. So you can see that 3 of these are WPA2 personal, and 1 of them is WPA2 enterprise. But more importantly, these bottom 3 are actually SSIDs, and the top one is a Hotspot 2.0 profile. So this Hotspot 2.0 profile does not care what SSID it connects to. It's not about the SSID anymore. It's completely agnostic. So it could be, it could be anything, whatever you want it to be. It makes a connection decision based on something else, based on the connection profile or the policy that you've put on that device. So, so what network authentication realms you can connect to, what roaming consortiums you can connect to, all of this other information. So then also looking at sort of from a Galaxy S3 implementation, this is just a connected device. So you see still that we have an SSID. So the SSID still has potentially some value for marketing, I guess, but not necessarily for as a decision criteria for a connection. And then you have a venue name, so you can actually identify where am I at? Is this if I'm at Hilton Hotel, say that, or if I'm at, some coffee shop or a ballpark or wherever I'm at, you actually can understand, is this network being offered by the venue where I'm trying to connect? And then the operator also. Yeah, Chris?
I'm just wondering, from the point of view of the user who set up Hotspot 2.0 that's coming in to try and use it, it seems like the only real indication that they've got there is in the name that this is a Hotspot 2.0 connection.
Right. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a good question. I guess I'm not sure why they would need to figure it out. I mean, I guess yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure why they would need to know the difference, other than for their own management purposes. If you want to delete or prioritize certain networks, so I guess to some extent that comes down to how you name the profile that you put on the device. But even in iOS or in Samsung's UI, you don't see those profiles, so it's not like, and it's not quite the same. So.
I mean, what I was getting at more is like most of the systems that we have out there, they'll cache the names, and you know what that name is connected to because you've connected to it before. But if you're just doing scanning of what networks are out there,
right. Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. Yeah. So, in terms of making a manual choice, is that kind of what you mean? In terms of making a manual choice?
Yeah. Do they need to make manual choice? I'm not sure.
No, I mean, I think that's the whole goal. Is that if you have a Hotspot 2.0 credential provisioned on your device, that connection is automated in the background. So you don't need to do that. Right, exactly, yeah, and then there's prioritization. Here you can actually configure your prioritization, but iOS has, Apple's documented prioritization. So if you have a profile that's saved on an iOS device, for example, for an enterprise network, it'll prefer that. And then so there's a long list of 8 or 9 different SSID types or different network types that if you have a profile for that, it prefers them in a specific order. So yeah, so it's sort of managed for you by iOS, but on Mavericks you can actually control it a little bit more. So yeah.
Are those profiles manually provisioned on each end device, or how are they provisioned? How are they updated?
That'll be a part of the release 2 process. Yeah, good question.
So far as I've set out a start configuration several times, but I've just never been able to complete it because it's so complicated. I think this comes down to that the open, where I'm confused is the open versus the .1x SSID. So my working assumption is that if I've got a pre-provisioned device and .1 info has been pushed down to me, for example, by my carrier on my iPhone, then I've got the creds already, and I can go straight onto the .1x SID, and it's totally open and transparent in that case. So I think the scenario Chris is talking about is I don't have to push, I walk into an environment. So is that the scenario where then there's the open SID and the flag in terms of, I forget what it's called, but basically service available, but registration available?
Yeah, sort of a provisioning SSID versus something that's provisioned for you in advance. Right, yeah, that's right, yeah.
So I would come in there, and then at the end of that process, I get a push to the device, and at that point, I transition to the DOS.
That's right. Yep. That's right. Yeah. And so I think that Dave's covering some of that. So just a step ahead of us. But yeah. So there's pre-provisioning so that when you show up to the network, you're already provisioned and connects automatically. And then there's on-site provisioning, one-time provisioning. So the first time I've been to this network, I need to be provisioned for that credential. And so it's not the same as you go to an enterprise today and it's just an open network, and you got to decide whether or not, as the end user, you got to decide whether or not you're going to trust them to put something on your device. There's some enhancements to make it so that it's not the same level of trust issue for that sort of public provisioning type of approach. But yeah, so I think that I'll leave that to Dave to cover. So going back to this idea, so we have this problem, right? We talk about SSID overutilization. You don't want too many SSIDs, and we get into this interesting conversation with 11U. We're trying to add all this information to the pre-association process. We want clients to have a lot of information about the network. But from a management perspective, we have to make sure we don't deploy too many SSIDs, but we also have to make sure from a protocol design perspective that we don't build our beacons and probe responses to be too big. It's the same problem. It's management overhead. It's SSID bloat. So how do you solve bloating? Gas, right? So that's, so they built this protocol into Wi-Fi to be able to manage this SSID overhead problem. All that 11U information is not relevant to everyone, so put some of it in the beacon, and then allow the client device to find out more by querying. So GAS is a protocol that's, so we have different frame types in Wi-Fi management, data and control frames. Management frames, there's a type of frame called an action frame. And a public action frame specifically allows the client device to ask the access point something before it connects. So GAS is essentially a framework protocol that allows the client device to do that, and GAS carries something called an advertisement protocol. 11U is built on an advertisement protocol called ANQP. It has options to be able to do more than just ANQP if someone wants to develop a vendor proprietary protocol, or the Wi-Fi Alliance, for example, wants to make extensions to the protocol. You can do that as well. But ANQP is sort of the de facto standard for 11U and Hotspot 2.0. And the basic idea is just this. I found out some information in the SSID. I want to find out more. Please tell me these things. So there's a list of capabilities that it can query for. It does the query and asks all these different things: venue name, IP addressing, NAI realm, all of this stuff. The access point replies. So it gives back information here. So it tells you the venue name, the IP addressing scheme, authentication realms, all of that information. So some of that information is, it makes sense, and you can see how it would be used. When we talk about decision-making criteria, what is the client going to make its decision based upon? So how is it going to decide to join one network versus the other? These are some of the really sort of most critical elements of that decision process. So starting at the first one, 3GPP information, cellular mobile network operators were sort of really the initial, push for 11U because, hey, everyone talks about data offload and capacity and all these things. And, so they're kind of like, hey, maybe Wi-Fi is a good supplement. We want to make authentication at a Wi-Fi network, be able to use our existing, HLRs on the back end for, user authentication. So why don't we just build this into the network advertisement process? Basically, it says, hey, this information supports 3GPP connection for these mobile network operators. So there's a PLMN ID, public land mobile network, which is really just an ID code for a carrier. So it's a mobile country code and a mobile network code. So if you have a cellular phone, for example, with SIM credential, it sees that network, it sees that PLM ID for which it has a credential, and it knows, hey, I can connect to this network using my SIM as authentication. This network has access to my authentication that I need, so I can connect to Wi-Fi using my cellular credential as authentication. Make sense? Good? Yeah, and well, it's, yeah, I mean, it's sort of.
Who's the governing body for that standard?
I'm not sure I understood. Are you asking in terms of just the framework for them to do the authentication peering? That's really what the WBA is handling with the next generation hotspot.
The back-end roaming agreements. So. Yeah, so that's all IEEE stuff, 802.11u, and so then it's certified in Hotspot 2.0. Yeah. So yeah, so just as far as the organization process goes, so it does get a little bit confusing and complex because there's so many different moving parts, right? I mean, there's the Wi-Fi side, the client side, the infrastructure side, the radius side, the back-end authentication side, and there's so many different moving parts here. So that's what makes it kind of interesting, and unfortunately has been probably slower to market than people would like it to be, because it's a super useful protocol, but when it depends on all these different organizations that have a different viewpoint of the world and how it should be, getting everyone to be cohesive about how to implement it is tough. So
is there a governing body in the U.S. that governs the standardization of the 3GPP handoff
to Wi-Fi?
Yeah.
Well, I think that there have been attempts to do that in 3GPP. I don't remember the exact spec names. I have some of them, and I could send them to you. But yeah, so I think they've tried to implement that within 3GPP. Sort of the GSM, group.
The reason I ask is because we work with a couple of carriers here in the U.S. and then a couple in South America, and I'm getting hit on this all the time.
Yeah.
How should we design? Who's going to be governing this, and which standard should we use?
And that, I think to some extent that becomes a conversation of what an MNO wants or an MSO wants versus what an Apple or a Google or a Samsung wants, and what permissions they're going to allow. Some of those types of political conversations, unfortunately. So yeah.
There's different levels of handoff as well, right?
Sure.
There's off period, and then there's actual session handoff.
We're trying to find that common ground or common area of handoff where there will be a solidified governance of standardization.
Yeah.
And it's like this right now.
Yeah. So in the real world, MNOs, may not be the ones that are using Hotspot 2.0, so it may not be, that carrier ID that someone wants to authenticate to. So Hotspot 2.0 release 1 says client devices have to support, if they have an eSIM credential, good for them, but they must support TLS and TTLS as far as EAP types go. So, so thinking about more public networks, MSO networks, any type of public Wi-Fi network that's not dependent upon a cellular carrier, they said, hey, we want to make it accessible to have, authentication credentials for that. So TLS and TTLS, and so you'd identify your NAI realm basically. It sort of functions like a domain, right? So you have a user at domain or user at realm. So if you know that, for example, you have a credential for for Google.com or for CableLabs.com or for Bandwidth.com or whoever that provider is, they would advertise this NAI realm, and as long as you have a credential for that realm, you can connect. So it's sort of the same idea. Is we're just looking for something that we have a compatible credential for. So in this case, we have CableLabs, and the EAP method is TTLS for CableLabs, and it even shows the inner authentication type for TTLS. So again, the client gets to find out this information before it even attempts to connect, so it knows beforehand, I have a valid credential for this network. So then, moving past individual identifiers, kind of getting to some of these questions that we've had, roaming consortiums or organization identifiers. We have this way that either MNOs or other organizations can partner together and offer an OI that essentially advertises a shared authentication option, or or you can have these sort of intermediate clearing options for authentication, roaming hubs or whatever you want to call them. And that roaming hub is some organization that on the back end ties into all of the different authentication services, all the different credential providers. And so they might offer, maybe it's Cineverse or someone like that offers their OI, and advertises it in that beacon. So if you have authentication options through Cineverse, you see that OI, you know that you can connect. So, just kind of one more option to be able to connect through. And then there's more information that's advertised in beacons, the friendly name and the venue name, like I showed earlier on that Samsung, the Samsung device. So just a way to identify the actual operator of the network as well as the venue owner. And then also, the domain name of the operator, bigbooty.com. And then there's really two more that I think are quite interesting. WAN metrics is one. You think about network selection, decision-making criteria. Should I leave an LTE connection for Wi-Fi? I mean, I don't know. I don't know if a Wi-Fi network's any better than LTE. I don't know if it offers any services that I want that maybe I don't have on LTE or can't support on LTE. So this is sort of a noble idea. Whether or not each venue is going to want to advertise their WAN metrics is sort of up to them and becomes a marketing decision to some extent. And also there has to be some protocol tie-in on the backside. So either the AP has to be able to test, or the system has to be able to test WAN connectivity, or it needs to get that information from a router. So a fantastic idea and could be super useful, but whether it'll actually come to real world, we'll see. And then there's another one, the capability. The connection capability element, which essentially says, at this network you can access these specific services. So if you have, a wireless company that wants to, a wireless operator that wants to say Wi-Fi is primary, and we want to support voice over Wi-Fi, they might say, hey, we want to use SIP at these specific UDP ports. So before I connect to this Wi-Fi network, I know that SIP is important to me. I want to make sure that this network supports that specific protocol. Or maybe it's a VPN protocol, or maybe it's an HTTPS protocol, or whatever the case may be. Finding out that information in advance is really what this is all about, is knowing something before you connect. So let me pass this back off to Dave here.
Okay.
I did want to just mention.
So yeah, don't think weird things about Marcus. That's my PCAP. And does anybody know what that's an homage to? Movie from the 80s, one of my favorites. I was hoping that Lee would be here. He would know. The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension. John? Yeah. Okay. Anyways. So I have all sorts of weird things going on in my house in terms of the names I use for stuff. But the relevance of the domain name is you can figure that on the network. You can figure that on the client. If they match, then the client knows it's operating on what it considers a home network. And if it doesn't match, it will still connect if the things that Marcus talked about, the realm or the 3GPP or the roaming consortium OIs match. So it would still connect. But if the domain doesn't match, it knows that it's roaming. It knows that this is a roaming partner that it's connecting to. And like on the Samsung implementation, you get a slightly different indicator in the Wi-Fi notification. It's either an H, home, or an R, roaming. So just thought I would mention that. So we really need to pick up the pace, don't we? So pieces are coming together. So as Marcus said, we would like this all to have happened a little bit more quickly. We were waiting for clients up until relatively recently. The WLAN equipment came together pretty quickly after Passpoint Release 1 launched. Then Samsung came out with the S4, first commercially available handset that supported Passpoint. Apple now has broad support in most, I shouldn't say most, a lot of iOS 7 devices, so iPhone 5, iPad 3 and later, iPad mini, iPod 5th gen, iPod Touch 5th gen, and now OS X Mavericks all support Hotspot 2.0, so all those Apple devices. So we've got wireless LAN equipment, we've got mobile devices now, we've got a lot of operators who are interested in deploying this, and you should be seeing some announcements in the next couple of months about some Hotspot 2.0 deployments. There are plenty of people who want to do credential provisioning. And then the one thing that'll probably be the last to really show up will be the AAA peering and roaming hubs, and we just need the rest of it to happen before those really become relevant. But the pieces are coming together. What was still missing really was how do we get credentials onto these devices? So there's a couple of questions already about how do I provision a device? Do I have to do that manually? So I'm going to go quickly through that. So essentially at this point there are two options for Hotspot 2.0 credential provisioning. You've got the ability to use the Apple Mobile Configuration Profile Framework with their devices to put a Hotspot 2.0 credential on the device over the air. And then you've got Hotspot 2.0 Release 2. So the whole scope of Release 2 is really about credential and policy provisioning to a device. A couple of distinctions here between the two. The Apple solution is available today. You can push a Hotspot 2.0 credential to an Apple, to one of the supported Apple devices today using that framework. Hotspot 2.0 Release 2 is, again, in development. The certification should launch. I mean, I shouldn't say it's in development. The development's done. It's now in the point where they're just putting together the test bed, and the certification will launch in the first half. So we're almost there, but not quite.
So would it be safe to say that any mobile device management appliances that are supporting the Apple config profiles are able to push that as well?
They would have to have been updated to support the specific XML attributes for Hotspot 2.0, but I know of a number of them that are working in that direction. So, yes. So the way that the mobile config profiles works, you can go out and just download the Apple configurator utility for Mac OS, or provisioning MDM vendor would support this. Now I'm sorry for the quality of that, but now in Apple configurator there's a Hotspot 2.0 network type. Once you select that, you don't have to worry about the SSID anymore. You just put in the TLS, TTLS, or SIM parameters. That gets bundled up into a mobile config file, and you can push it via email or HTTPS. And just like any other profile, the user gets prompted to install it, and once it's installed, it's on and going. So Release 2, a little bit different. So Release 2 starts out with the idea that I've just got this Release 2 capable client over here. And then somewhere out in my network, I have a Hotspot 2.0 Release 2 online sign-up server. And then the Hotspot network, and that could be the Hotspot network associated with that same provider that's hosting the OSU server, or it could be a partner of that, is now going to use the Access Network Query Protocol to advertise to the client that online sign-up is available. And I've got some other slides that go into a little bit of detail on this, but the client can say, okay, yeah, I'd like to sign up for service. I don't have any other way to get on right now. If so, it goes ahead and initiates a connection, and we'll go through how the details on this work, but connects to the OSU server. The OSU server, there's some registration process that happens to identify the user and perhaps validate a password or whatnot. And then the server essentially creates a package, and it's specifically called a Per Provider Subscription Management Object, or PPSMO. And the PPSMO would include either the credential itself or a pointer to the credential, like a SIM. It would include things about policy around the use of that credential. So I can specify preferred roaming partners. I can blacklist certain SSIDs. We can talk, as Marcus was mentioning, you can specify the connection capabilities. I need to have these ports open, or I want this amount of backhaul. And then also you can specify things about the subscription. This credential is good for X number of days, or this credential is good until you use this amount of data, those sorts of things. You also set intervals about the updating of the policy and the updating of the subscription. So you can set, an interval in terms of how often the client should come back and look to see if there's any new information for it, and then home provider info. So that all gets packaged up into this PPSMO and gets stored onto the device. And then the client can repeat this process with multiple providers. And each provider is going to put their PPSMO together and put it on the device. This is all using the Open Mobile Alliance Device Management Framework, so OMA-DM, if you're familiar with that. And the nice aspect of that is each management object is locked to the provider. So the provider that issued this top management object, they're the only ones who have rights to modify that or delete it, right? So if AT&T provisions a management object to the device, that's great, but Time Warner can't then impact AT&T's credential. And all the policy parameters I talked about, those apply to the credential. So AT&T can provide policy around the use of its SIM. That doesn't affect your use of Time Warner's. If you've got a Time Warner TTLS credential, AT&T obviously doesn't have the ability to impact that. So the management object is locked to the provisioning authority who created it. And the user then will have the ability to order those. So the user can say, I prefer this management object. This is my first choice for connection. I want to prefer my mobile operator. And then I've got these other ones that are secondary or tertiary. So that's all part of the specification. Not enough time to go through this in too much detail. Just how things are sort of laid out within Release 2. You've got the servers, so this is the online sign-up and the policy server components, which provisioning subscriber portal for registration, AAA, some sort of identity management, the actual profiles themselves, and a CA. And the CA becomes a critical component of this for a reason that I'll talk about next. On the controller, you do your configuration. It would also be doing the radius proxy and the proxy ARP. The AP is doing the level 2, layer 2, so that's where ANQP and GAS is going on. We're also doing management frame protection, so that's happening at the AP, and then the support on the end station itself. Okay, so this is a good demonstration of what would actually happen in a live network, and this is what we tend to demonstrate when we show Release 2. The reason. Okay, so kind of back to the question about do I need a provisioning SSID. With Hotspot 2 Release 2, you will require an online sign-up SSID, and that's this bottom one. It's called we call it the OSU WLAN. That can either be open, it can be an open SSID, or it can be encrypted using essentially a server-side only authentication mechanism. And unfortunately, I can't go into too many details of that until the tech spec is published. But essentially what that's going to do is we obviously don't know a lot about the client, but we want to allow the client to securely sign up for service. So the clients will authenticate the servers and the network, but the network and the servers won't authenticate the clients. And there's mechanisms within Release 2 to do that. So again, open or secured, server-side only secured OSU WLAN down here. So I get a client, it shows up into my hotspot. In this case, I'm just showing that I don't need to have two production Hotspot 2.0 WLANs. The demonstration, we do some examples of operator policy so I can steer the client to one of these two green Hotspot 2.0 WLANs. That's why I have two. But what will happen is on those WLANs, we're now going to advertise that online sign-up is available. So via ANQP, we're telling the client has no credential, not even associated to the network. We're telling it via these ANQP conversations that Release 2 is supported here and online sign-up is supported. And what that will do is it will, if the user wants, like I'll show you in a second, the Samsung current implementation, you'll get a notification saying that Passpoint services are available. If you click on that, You'll then be presented with essentially a pop-up that'll tell you about the providers that are available there for you to sign up for service with. So this would be a name and or an icon that would show up and prompting the user, hey, if you'd like to sign up for service, just click on this. If the user then goes ahead and clicks on one of the online sign-up providers, what'll happen is that'll trigger a connection to the OSU WLAN, right? So it tells them, hey, go ahead, connect to this OSU WLAN. They do that. It also pushes a URL to them or URI to them. And they'll go ahead and load that in their browser. There's mechanisms to trigger the browser load. And it'll connect to the OSU URI. Browser comes up, and there's a registration page where they go ahead and register for service. They go ahead and register, they submit that. The OSU server then creates the PPSMO, which is the credential and parameters around it, pushes that back, and the push happens over, it's happening over HTTPS, but it can use two different formats. It can either be SOAP XML or it can be the OMA-DM format. So there's two different formattings of the PPSMO. That gets pushed back to the device, to the client. Client stores that. It now has credentials and parameters. And using those credentials and parameters, it connects to the Hotspot 2.0 network. So we've gone from having a device that didn't know anything about anything, and now it's provisioned and connected to the network. So now I'm going to skip this. There's just some configuration examples, and that slide is practically unreadable. Operator policy, this would be the ability to, we mentioned that you have the ability to specify roaming partner preference with release 2. Quick example of that, the default roaming partner priority is 128. So if I had pushed a credential to a client and it said, and the credential, by the way, so the home operator here is the WFA for the purposes of this demonstration. So it's a WFA credential, and we're saying we've pushed a credential to the client. The roaming partner preference for the domain Ruckus Wireless is 1. The default roaming priority is 128, and the lower number is preferred. So because the domain of this top WLAN is Ruckus Wireless, the client will connect there. Does that make sense? If I then do an update on the server saying, hey, client, I want you to update your priority for Ruckus Wireless to 130, and either at the next interval where the client does its own policy update, because remember the client has an update interval at which it's supposed to check in to see if there's any new updates. If that happens, that's one way, or we can use WNM to tell the client that it's time for it to receive an update. So we're actually leveraging the WNM framework here as well. But either client initiated or server initiated, we do a policy update. We push the new priority to that management object associated with this WFA credential. Now all of a sudden, the priority for Ruckus Wireless is 130. And what that's going to do is it's going to drop the connection here, and it'll connect over to our other WLAN because that is now a least cost path, if you will. So that's just an operator policy example. I'm getting the pull sign. Do I have 5 minutes, Keith, to do a demonstration? I have 2 minutes. I can do a demonstration in 2 minutes. We can do this. So, all right. This is a Samsung client. You guys will probably be the only ones who ever see this because I just got it from them last week. And I should be getting a new iteration of it. Oh, hello. Come on, HDMI. Oh, you were there. Oh, I bet let me try it now. It's not working. I will do this demonstration for. Working? Oh yeah, sorry.
Check the physical.
Thank you, Keith. That was when we were having the VGA color issues, and I was, yeah. So always fix your troubleshooting when you're done with it. Now what? Okay, we're going to try this one last time. And if this doesn't work here, I will be happy to do demonstrations. Aha, there we go. Okay, so as I was saying, you guys are the only ones who are ever going to see this because I'm getting a new iteration of this and it's a developmental. This is Samsung Galaxy S4 Release 2 client. Right now there's no credential, so if I looked at subscribed services, it is blank. There is nothing there. If I enable Auto Connect and enable Passpoint roaming and enable Passpoint, what you may see up here at the top is that we can click to subscribe. So this is the notification. So it is learning over the network from that IP over there via ANQP that OSU is available. I click on that. This is the OSU list. So I now have this little green icon and some text here asking me if I want to subscribe for service. If I click that, what we're now going to see is it's going to connect to the OSU WLAN here momentarily, and then load the browser page going to the OSU registration portal. Browser comes up, loading the page. We'll get an SSL issue here, which is fine, just bypass that. And here's the registration page. So I'm just going to quickly put in some garbage information to get this done. Submit the registration. Congratulations, you successfully subscribed. What we'll see now is we get dropped off of the OSU WLAN. We get pushed back to here. Subscription provisioning is successful. We've dropped off the OSU WLAN. And now if I back out, I'll just show it to you this way real quick. If I go here, this is a developmental version, so they've given us some visibility into the PPSMO. This is the PPSMO that we just received from the OSU server here. And what you may have noticed is we just connected to the Hotspot 2.0 network using the credential. So now we're connected, we're roaming, so that's the little R up in the upper left-hand corner. And so we went from having nothing on the phone to being provisioned with a TTLS credential and connected to the Hotspot 2.0 network. So thank you very much for your time.